If you're old like me and you've been building websites since these days, or perhaps these days, you know how far the web has come in the last 20 years. In this video, I want to have some fun just reminiscing about how we used to have to do things. You know, the classic, we walk to school in the snow uphill both ways, that kind of stuff, but also I want to appreciate how good the web is today. And specifically, I want to showcase how much you can do even with zero build tools, or the no build approach. In other words, this should be the first video on YouTube that talks about both tables for layout and native ES modules and import maps. So grab yourself a beverage of choice, relax, and let's walk through this example project I've put together that shows just how good browsers have gotten in the last 20 years. Whether you're an old fart or a young punk, I think by the end of this, you'll feel pretty thankful. This was Apple's homepage in 2004. This was Microsoft's homepage in 2004. But this isn't a video about the history of design. I want to talk about web browser features. And the reason we're looking at this old homepage is to show you that this used tables for layout. Yes, back then, in order to have anything sit side by side, like how these links sit side by side, or down here, like how this column sits side by side, these four columns, in order to have anything that sat multiple items per row, you had to use tables for layout. Don't believe me? If I just right click and choose inspect, there you have it. Table, table body, table row, table cells. This was the only way to add layout to pages back during that time. Luckily nowadays, here's my demo site. You can find the source code for this on GitHub in the description of this video. But nowadays, the only time we ever need to have a table in our HTML is if we actually have tabular data. Let's take a quick time out in web browser history for today's sponsor. Well, I shouldn't say sponsor. I was not paid to make this video, but I do want to thank EpoMaker for sending me their RT82 keyboard. I've reviewed quite a few keyboards on this channel by now, and this is one of my favorites. I don't know if it's the retro color scheme or the switch type. It's a Sea Salt Silent switch type. It reminds me of a Cherry MX Silent Red switch, but a bit more satisfying. I can't really put into words why, but I've been finding myself typing very accurately on this keyboard. It's just been really enjoyable. It has a little screen in the top right. You can upload a custom GIF, but longtime fans of my channel will know that I'm perfectly happy with this default cat GIF. I can recommend this keyboard with no hesitation. If you're interested in checking it out, there's a link in the description. Now let's get back to web browser history. Fast forward a few years, and here's Apple's homepage in 2009. Here is Microsoft's homepage in 2009. They want me to install Silverlight. I'm going to say no thank you. But at this point, web standards had really shaped the culture of web design and pushed forward the use of CSS and more semantic HTML. This means we no longer needed to use tables for layout, and instead we used floats. Now, if you're new to web development, you're probably wondering what even is a float. Well, if we look at the Apple website and then come down to these four columns and I inspect one, you see this div houses all four of those columns, and then inside each link is an image, and its CSS is saying float left. This was the way that we handled layout for many, many years. Until Flexbox came around, this was really our only tool for creating multiple columns and, complex layouts. If we look at the Microsoft website, they're using the same strategy to create, this column and this column. They're using floats. Now, in today's world, the only time you would ever need to use floats would be if you actually, like this image of the leaf, it's floated to the right, and then as I resize my browser, notice the text just sort of wraps around the image. So the image is floated to the right, almost like an image in an old-fashioned newspaper, right? It's wrapped around it or floated. This is the only situation where you would ever use floats in the modern era. But for a long time, like many, many years, I would say at least about a decade, floats were the only way that we could create layouts. And because floats were never truly designed to create multi-column layouts like this, they were designed to enable text wrapping around content like this, that means you had to implement all sorts of hacks and workarounds, like a clear fix, and everyone had their own different way of doing it. It was just a mess. But everything during this era was a mess. My favorite example of this is a library. Yes, you're reading the name right. It was called DD Roundies. And this was how you added rounded corners to your elements. It used Microsoft's vector graphics or something like that, and it looked at your CSS, and if you tried to use border radius, it injected a little fake rounded corner. I mean, this is what people had to do in order to create anything other than a basic rectangle. During this era, we didn't have a correct layout tool, so you had to use a tiling image to create the illusion of equal height multiple columns. You needed hacks and polyfills just to create rounded corners, and almost anything you saw, whether it was a shadow, a gradient, a rounded corner, it was an image. The browser couldn't do it, so you'd have to either have a pre-rastered image or some sort of really creative solution. Also, even just fonts. You could only use fonts that were installed on the user's computer. There was no such thing as web font during this time. So if you wanted to use a custom font, you either had to save it as a raster image, like a JPEG or a PNG, or the beloved GIF format. Or if you were really creative and resourceful, there was this technique called Cipher, or Scalable Inman Flash Replacement. And what this did was it found, like, let's say you wanted all heading level 2s on your page. It would look at the content, find whatever text you actually typed in for that heading level 2, and then it would create a matching Flash element, or, Flash file, Macromedia Flash, Adobe Flash, rest in peace, using that same text, and then, Flash had the capability of applying a custom font. That is the sort of length we had to go to have custom fonts that weren't installed on a user's computer actually live as real text, real accessible text, instead of a raster image. So long story short, back during this time, anything that looked cool was an image. Anything that wasn't literally a solid color, perfectly squared rectangle was an image. These shadows were images. This gradient was an image. Anything that had equal height, most likely, used a tiling image of some sort. Sprites were a really big thing back at this time. In other words, as a front-end web developer, you actually spent a lot of your time in Photoshop slicing and splicing up the design into little tiny images to create corners and shadows and gradients and equal height columns, so on and so forth. Also during this time, you really couldn't use JavaScript. I mean, don't get me wrong, browsers had JavaScript, but you most likely were using jQuery. In fact, if we look at Microsoft's webpage and click View Page Source, now again, this is Microsoft's webpage in 2009, but if I search for jQuery, there it is. Why was everyone using jQuery? Because back at this point in history, there wasn't a guaranteed reliable way to do basic things like select an element on the page or modify its classes or attributes. You would have to write it a couple different ways depending on the browser, and so instead of handling that yourself, you could just use jQuery, and that library handled that sort of cross-browser, basic JavaScript features for you. Nowadays, if we look back at my example site, we don't have to worry about any of this. With JavaScript, you can just use plain vanilla JavaScript. You don't need to use jQuery. You can document.query selector in peace. And you don't need to use an image for anything other than an actual image or photograph, right? So we have gradients and rounded corners and shadows. We have web fonts, right? This font isn't installed on my machine, no problem. Fast forward to somewhere around 2016, give or take a year in either direction, and by this time, Google Chrome had been around for about 8 years, and that was long enough for it to really push things forward. So now we had, rounded corners, shadows. You could use vanilla JavaScript instead of jQuery. We had Flexbox, and in just another year or so, we would get CSS Grid. The browser was exponentially more modern. However, at this time, there was still a huge, gargantuan, Grand Canyon-sized gap between the way that developers wanted to work and the way that web browsers worked. And so this is when build tools became more and more popular, and we had things like pre-processing and post-processing and minifiers and uglifiers and transpiling and Everlaster gobstopper piling and Browserify and Bower and Grunty Gulpy, Sassy CSSE, Post CSSE, Webpacky, Babel, ECMA Megapack, UltraPack 9000, and all of them broke every 2 months due to NPM package updates. Why did we have all of these things? 3 main reasons. Reason number 1, in my opinion, is because ECMAScript 2015 or ES6 came out, and developers wanted to write JavaScript using it, but browsers did not support it yet. Another reason is because browsers didn't support variables in CSS or nesting in CSS or color functions, so on and so forth. So you almost had to use either Sass or Stylus or Less or Post CSS plugins, so on and so forth. And then the third big reason is because HTTP2 hadn't become super ultra ubiquitous in the mainstream protocol yet, and HTTP 1.1 was significantly worse than HTTP 2 at letting visitors download multiple files. We'll talk more about this in just a minute, but this meant that for performance reasons, you really wanted to send as few files to the visitor as possible, and so bundling was a must. Long story short, developers wanted to write code that was organized, easy to maintain, and that used modern syntax, but the browser just wasn't there yet. So there were all these tools that took place in the middle. You wrote your code one way, how you wanted it to be, and then the tools got your code ready for the browser. This still goes on today, and maybe there are valid reasons instead of these three reasons that I just listed. Maybe your project uses React or TypeScript. I'm not trying to take anything away from anyone. If you enjoy the tools you're using, please continue to use them. But I'm just letting you know that in the current year, you don't have to use build tools if you don't want to. These three reasons that I just mentioned, modern JavaScript syntax, CSS options in the browser, and browser protocols, all of those are so good now that you can have a surprisingly good developer experience with zero build tools. So right now I want to walk through this example site that I put together. We'll talk about the CSS, but especially the JavaScript. And I think if you haven't checked in on the way that browsers have been progressing lately, I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised. So first of all, the CSS. In my project, I have the CSS folder, and then we have a file like variables. So I only have to define my color once or certain values once. That may not be earth-shattering to you, but if I go into styles, you may not have been aware that CSS just natively supports nesting now. You can nest one rule inside of another. We also have functions, or I should say color functions, so you can mix a color to be, 50% lighter or darker, or mix it with another color, or rotate it to be an opposing color. It's pretty fun that I can just change this one value from blue to green, and things get lighter, things get darker, everything just uses that. And because we have HTTP 2 or 3 or even beyond, it's okay to just split up your CSS across multiple files like this. There's virtually zero performance hit that you're taking by doing this. Bundling is not the absolute necessity that it used to be. Enough with CSS, let's get to the fun part, which is JavaScript. So I have a feature up in my header that says load expensive feature. And when I click that, let me zoom in, it's hard to see with this color. I'll zoom in for you though. That added this, and it added this. Let's go take a look at the JavaScript really quick. So that lives in main.js. So here's that button that I clicked, the load expensive JS. I'm using async await syntax to not even load that big JavaScript file until it's needed. I'm using native ES module import and export syntax. Right here I'm importing things. If I go into expensive feature, I'm exporting things. I'm using const and let and async await. I'm destructuring. I'm importing. I'm exporting. And in expensive features, I'm even pulling in, a function from a third-party package, Lodash, and I'm not even using npm. So how is that working? Because notice this looks like it would be a local file. It's not. This is working thanks to import maps. So in my HTML, which obviously you're not going to have to repeat yourself. This can be powered by a server-side language once, but you just spell out your imports. So you can have a reusable name that you can use across, 10 or 20 or 30 different JavaScript files. And this is where you spell out the exact path, and maybe the exact cache-busting version, so on and so forth. So what's cool is Lodash didn't even load until my expensive feature needed it, and I didn't have to spell out anything. The import map took care of that. I have all of my creature comforts of modern JavaScript, and if I look in my utils file, yes, just letting you know, even the class, right, the syntactic sugar of having classes in JavaScript, yep, browsers just support that natively now. Browsers support just about everything natively now. So getting away from JavaScript for a moment, we have SVG support, right? These are SVG icons, vector graphics. I remember as late as 2015 or even 2016, enterprise-level projects that had a large audience, like in the education or medical fields, we couldn't even use SVG files if a large percent of our audience was using an old enough version of Internet Explorer because it didn't support vector graphics. That's how far we've come. Nowadays, there is no such thing as Internet Explorer. They rebranded it as Internet Edge or Microsoft Edge, and now even that has been changed to use Chrome or Chromium underneath the hood. Let's see, another random feature is like lazy loading images. We used to have to use hacks and polyfills for that, but check this out. Let me open up my developer tools. And if I go to the network tab and hit refresh and select just images, you can see that the only image that is loaded so far is leaf.webp. Let's talk about WebP in just a minute too. But as I scroll through the page, I scroll down to right about here. Now in the background it loads in dog. You can scroll down a little bit farther. Only then, so right about here, it finally loads in cat. If you scroll down further, once cat is actually needed, there it is, it's already ready, but now you can see it finally loaded panda. So that's just natively in browsers now. It's as easy as just adding loading equals lazy on an image. Also, WebP. We're not limited to just JPEG and PNG and GIF. I know there are formats even better than WebP, but WebP has really good browser support and great performance and file size. If you've never experimented with modern image formats, there's this amazing web app you can try. It's called squoosh.app. I believe it's created by Google themselves. You just drag and drop an image onto here and you can choose from so many different modern formats that are so much more efficient than JPEG and PNG. Let's see, one last feature I wanted to show off in my example site. Up at the top here for the navigation, you can see the content here fades in as I go to different pages, and the URL address bar is changing. I can use the browser's back button to go back a page. I can use the forward button to go forward a page. So I implemented spa-like behavior, and all I did was use swap, and I didn't even have to have npm. I'm just pulling it in my import map. Couldn't be any easier. I think in just another 6 months or a year or two, I won't even use this. I'll just use native page transitions. The last time I checked on those, maybe 6 months or a year ago, they weren't quite where I wanted them to be yet in terms of browser support and documentation and just finding a completely foolproof way of implementing them. But I'm hopeful that soon enough we won't even use any kind of library. Page transitions will just save the day for that spa-like feel. But yeah, let's see. One last detail is just CSS grid. So this area is broken up into thirds horizontally and vertically, and this area knows to take up 2 width containers and 2 vertical containers, and even if you refresh things, or resize things, it all just scales perfectly. Grid is essentially Flexbox, but on 2 axes instead of just 1. Horizontal and vertical. At this point now I'm just rambling because that has nothing to do with build tools. That's just a celebration of how good modern layout tools are. I mean, this whole video is just a celebration of how good everything browser related has gotten. Whether you want to use build tools or not, I encourage you to just go experiment with some of the new things that are available in the browser. That is going to bring this video to a close. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check out my website at learnwebco.com. I have a lot of premium courses available. My newest course, you'll find a link to it in the description, uses GitHub Copilot with agentic AI features where we build this fun app where you enter a noun, an adjective, a verb, and a location, and you can create 3D cartoon animals using AI image generation. But even just developing the app, we're using a light tech stack of PHP, SQLite, and Tailwind, but we're not even writing the code ourselves. We're using Copilot's agent mode. It's a really fun course. You can check this out. Another great way to support the YouTube channel at the bottom of my website. If you need hosting, I've used DreamHost for the last 19 years. And I also just added this Buy Me a Coffee area. Thanks for watching until the very end, and I'll catch you in the next video.